Today in the Daily Dose, historic presidential elections. The resignation of George Washington. In the summer of 1781, British General George Cornwallis marched an approximate 8,000-man army into the Virginia port city of Yorktown, expecting to meet British ships sent from New York to replenish his badly reduced stores of food and ammunition. By early October, however, with no British ships on the horizon, General George Washington and French General Jean-Baptiste Rochambeau lay siege to Yorktown by surrounding the city with 17,000 French and American troops, while French Admiral François de Grasse patrolled the Chesapeake Bay and the mouth of the York River, intent on blocking any British attempts to flee. 3 weeks later, on October 19th of that same year, Cornwallis agreed to Washington's terms of surrender, as laid out in his Articles of Capitulation, effectively ending the Revolutionary War. Peace negotiations stalled for the next 2 years in Paris due to Britain's initial refusal to acknowledge American independence and sovereignty, a point which Americans John Adams, Ben Franklin, and John Jay refused to remove from the negotiating table. After the election of a new, more pro-American parliament was seated in London, led by newly elected British Prime Minister Lord Shelburne, who saw the chance to build a lucrative trade alliance with the new nation, minus the cost of civil and military oversight, the British signed the Treaty of Paris at the Hôtel de York on September 3, 1783, before its ratification by the Continental Congress on January 14, 1784, from their seat at the Maryland State House in Annapolis. In between the formalities of ending the war, on December 23, 1783, standing before the Continental Congress, George Washington resigned his commission as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, expressing his desire to return to his beloved Mount Vernon as a private citizen, an event which historians consider a lasting testament to Washington's Republican values by handing his power back to the federal government. I have now the honor of offering my sincere congratulations to Congress, he addressed the body of legislators, and of presenting myself before them to surrender into their hands the trust committed to me, and to claim the indulgence of retiring from the service of my country. Little did Washington know that his service would continue as the nation's first two-term president, making the resignation of George Washington a turning point moment during the birth of a nation. The American election of 1800. After the Constitutional Convention of 1787 established a system of electoral votes to determine which two winning candidates would become President and Vice President of the United States, the Founding Fathers soon split into a two-party system based on ideological differences. As a result, two factions emerged within the Federalist Party, rallying behind John Adams and Alexander Hamilton respectively, while the original Republican Party, which would later evolve into the modern Democratic Party, rallied behind Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. Fearing anarchic spillover during the peak years of the French Revolution, the Federalist-controlled Congress passed the Alien and Sedition Acts, later signed into law by President John Adams, while the Sedition Act in particular soon came to bear mainly against publishers of partisan newspapers who spoke badly about the party and affiliated politicians they opposed. For the election of 1800, the Federalists backed Adams for president, while South Carolinian Charles C. Pinckney was slated for the vice presidential slot, while the Republicans chose Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr in the same order. Both sides spared little rhetoric castigating their opponents, the Federalists painting Jefferson as a naive atheist philosopher bent on destroying the Republic, while the Republicans accused the Federalists of attempting to reinstate the same form of monarchic governance that the nation had so recently rid through war with Great Britain. thanks to a grievous instructional omission by the Republican leaders to their state electors. When the electoral votes were finally counted after the popular vote was in, Jefferson, who the Republicans originally envisioned as president, and Burr, slated for the VP slot, were tied at 73 votes each, while Adams received 65 votes to Pinckney's 64, which in turn called for a runoff vote in the House of Representatives between the two winning Republican candidates. To further complicate the political landscape, the House of Representatives had flipped to the Republicans in the election of 1800, yet the tie-breaking vote would fall on the Federalist-controlled lame duck Congress, who vehemently opposed both Republican candidates. Following 3 rounds of ballot votes and rising partisan tension that nearly spilled over into violence, Thomas Jefferson was named the nation's 3rd sitting president, and despite overwhelming Federalist disappointment, for the first time in American history, the nation witnessed the peaceful transfer of power from one political party to its opponent, beginning a long American tradition that persisted intact until the 2020 presidential election cycle, making the election of 1800 a divisive yet important turning point in the early years of the American Republic. The Union Army propels Lincoln to his 2nd term. Beginning with his meteoric rise to command in 1861, Major General George B. McClellan, known as Little Mac for his Napoleonic dash and zeal, inspired the devotion of thousands in Union blue. By the middle of the war, however, McClellan's failed 1862 Peninsula campaign frustrated Union Army soldiers, prompting them to call for greater commitment from the home front. McClellan's dismissal as Army of the Potomac field commander in November of 1862 stunned and saddened Northern soldiers. But when Little Mac sided with the anti-war Democrats and ran for president, Union Army sentiment shifted away from McClellan in support of President Lincoln. Following more bloodletting at Chancellorsville and Gettysburg, the depleted ranks of the Army of the Potomac voted overwhelmingly against Democrats in the gubernatorial contest of 1863. Demobilized enlisted men and junior officers from the Union Army injected themselves into the North's major cities, forming social clubs in solidarity with like-minded veterans, toasting the prospect of victory and marching in pro-war parades to sway the hearts of fence-sitters. Joining forces with war-ravaged veterans, torchlight parades filled city streets by night, each marcher convinced they were standard-bearers of righteousness against treason. Such partisan angst meant the parades and rallies were not always peaceful, such as the Democratic Torchlight Parade of October 29, 1864, when a band of anti-war Democrats stormed a Republican club, setting off a full-scale brawl in the streets. In the end, the Union soldier vote convincingly propelled Lincoln to his 2nd term in office, effectively cementing victory and reunification with the rebel South firmly into the annals of American history. Approximately 155,600 soldiers cast votes in the 1864 presidential election, 33,700 for McClellan, compared to 116,800 votes for Lincoln, while the Union Army as a whole reported 80% voter participation. Even more compelling, every state but one gave Lincoln a solid majority of its combined Union Army votes. In fact, soldiers from most states gave the Union ticket at least a 20% higher turnout than their civilian counterparts at home, shining a light on the power of the Union Army, both on and off the field of battle. Mugwumps. While the term mugwump comes from the Native American Algonquian language as far back as 1832, defined as an important person or kingpin with sanctimonious or holier-than-thou aloofness, in American politics of the late 19th century, Mugwumps were made up of Republican politicians at both the federal, state, and local levels who vehemently opposed political corruption then rampant in American politics. Among their primary grievances was the spoils system of political patronage, which allowed a winning political candidate to dole out government jobs and contracts to those who had supported their campaign prior to an election win. Although by the time the Mugwumps came to power, the Pendleton Act of 1883 had established the United States Civil Service Commission, intended to base government positions on merit and competency alone. Despite the Pendleton Act, appointments continued to be largely based on key political supporters behind a winning candidate, which effectively split the Republican Party in two during several consecutive sessions of Congress. One side became known as the half-breeds under the leadership of Senator James Blaine of Maine, and the stalwarts led by Roscoe Conklin of New York. Although never formally organized as a political party, independent Mugwumps played a key role in the presidential election of 1884, when they turned their backs on Republican presidential candidate James G. Blaine due to his long history of corrupt political patronage, instead throwing their support behind Democratic candidate Grover Cleveland, which ultimately gave Cleveland the White House. During the campaign cycle of the 1884 presidential election, Teddy Roosevelt shocked his upper-crust New York City friends by rejecting the Mugwumps by throwing his support behind Blaine's candidacy, which unified his Republican Party leadership while clearing the way for his own political aspirations, making Mugwumps a bygone force in late 19th century American politics. The turning point presidential election of 1896. During the late 1800s, one of the weightiest political topics was whether the American dollar should be backed by gold or silver. While sitting President Grover Cleveland favored the gold standard, many in the Populist Party and the rural agrarian wing of the Democratic Party supported the free silver movement. Silver was abundant at the time, thanks to the recent Comstock silver lode bonanza, prompting farmers to believe that a shift to silver would inflate currency in their favor, thereby increasing the prices farmers could receive for their crops, which would in turn help them pay down their debts. When the Democrats convened in Chicago to choose their presidential candidate in July of 1896, they turned their back on President Cleveland's support of the gold standard, making silver a central plank in their party platform. Instead, the convention threw its weight behind young rising star William Jennings Bryan, who delivered what would become one of the most famous political orations in the history of American politics. Known as the Cross of Gold speech, he brought the convention to its feet when he said, "You shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns," he bellowed to the room, placing an imaginary crown on his head. "You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold." Bryan traveled nearly 20,000 miles by rail around the country during his campaign and gave hundreds of speeches, often out of the back of his railroad car. Huge crowds greeted him everywhere, drawn by his oratorical skills and the passion he inspired in his supporters. In the end, despite Bryan's Herculean efforts, his campaign failed to broaden its support beyond its populist, agrarian Democratic base. More conservative Democrats who favored the gold standard split from the party to nominate their own national gold Democratic candidate, or even threw their support behind Republican candidate William McKinley. Republicans managed to attract some urban progressive voters by attacking Bryan as a religious fanatic, in addition to painting a dire picture of what abandoning the gold standard would mean to the American economy. On Election Day, voter turnout topped 79%, reflecting the high stakes of the contest. McKinley won some 600,000 more popular votes than Bryan, the widest margin since 1872, while his win in the Electoral College, 271 to 176, was even more decisive. Much like the elections of 1800, 1860, and 1932, the presidential election of 1896 marked a fundamental shift in American politics and the emergence of a new political reality that reflected the nation's changing demographics. McKinley's win began an era of Republican dominance and economic prosperity that would last for nearly 4 decades, foretelling the beginning and the end of the Populist Party. More importantly, the contentious election of 1896 marked a decisive tipping point for the nation's urban interest in banking, manufacturing, and industry, while turning away from the nation's agrarian past. With Americans migrating to cities at a rapidly increasing rate in the last decade of the 19th century, Bryan would be the last candidate to run for president by appealing exclusively to the country's rural base. The Watergate Scandal. In 1972, when Richard Milhous Nixon began campaigning for a second term in office, Americans were politically divided over the Vietnam War, leading Nixon's advisors to employ aggressive and quite illegal campaigning techniques, which saw members of Nixon's Committee to Re-elect the President, known derisively as CREEP, to break into the Democratic National Committee's headquarters in the Watergate office complex in Washington, D.C., bugging phone lines and copying top-secret documents in an effort to gain an upper hand on their political rivals. When the wiretaps began to fail, however, on June 17th of that same year, 5 burglars were caught red-handed as they prepared for a second break-in, leading detectives to find evidence on the men, including a phone number to an office in the White House.
People have got to know whether or not their president's a crook. Well, I'm not a crook.
Over the next 2 years, the truth would be revealed through the efforts of a Senate investigating committee led by trial judge John Sirica and an independent special prosecutor named Archibald Cox, along with 2 investigative reporters from the Washington Post named Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. Aided by an anonymous whistleblower codenamed Deep Throat, later revealed in 2005 to be Mark Felt, a former associate director at the FBI, Woodward and Bernstein exposed hush money payments to 7 burglars linked directly to the White House, as well as Nixon's push to have the CIA impede investigative efforts by the FBI. When White House counsel John Dean testified before the Senate's investigative committee about Nixon's insistence on taping all conversations to and from the Oval Office, lawmakers began a full-court press demanding that Nixon hand over all tapes in question. In what became known as the Saturday Night Massacre, when Cox refused to back down on his demands, on October 20th, 1973, Nixon ordered his firing, which in turn led several Justice Department officials to resign in protest. Matters worsened in March the following year, when a special grand jury indicted 7 former aides to the president, followed by a July order by the Supreme Court demanding that Nixon hand over all his tapes. And when Nixon dragged his feet on the matter, the House Judiciary Committee voted to impeach the president on charges of obstruction of justice, abuse of power, as well as criminal violations to the Constitution. Cornered and out of options, Nixon released the tapes on August 5, 1974, which exposed irrefutable evidence of his complicity. 3 days later, Nixon would become the first sitting American president to resign from office.
I have never been a quitter. To leave office before my term is completed is abhorrent to every instinct in my body. But as president, I must put the interests of America first. Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
A day later, Nixon would leave Washington for his adopted city of San Clemente, California, living quietly and largely out of the public's eye until his death on April 22, 1994, making the Watergate Scandal a Shakespearean tragedy come to life. And there you have it, historic presidential elections. Today's Daily Dose documentary is brought to you by Plato'sPeach.com, a lesson planning tool leveraging content like this and much more for educators and homeschooling parents. Check out the description for more information so that you too can teach something new every day.